Hi, hello everyone. My name is Omar Salam. I'm a member of the Open Labour National Committee. Thanks very much for joining this event today. The idea of this event was basically to try to contribute to the discussion about good jobs and what it means to have good jobs and how we get good jobs. I think that there's always been a kind of basis that from Labour that we stand for a high employment, that we stand for a minimum wage, those kind of things. And we obviously also, I think, stand for other aspects of good jobs, but maybe that's not being discussed quite as much. So hopefully the idea is to kind of have a rounded discussion about how we push that and so on. Personally, I think that some of the challenges we've seen from the right and the far right have in part been exacerbated by concerns about economic insecurity and about kind of those issues. If that, I think that's probably part of the story. It's probably not the whole story, but I think it is part of it. And I think that sometimes the debate can be a bit limited in that we might say we stand for a higher minimum wage, but the idea of minimum wage is it should really be a minimum. And I think we need to talk about how do we get wages growing in the economy year after year for the vast majority of people, kind of across the economy. And I think that's something we should be really talking about and really pushing politically. So we've got a great panel with us, which is going to tell us how we do it, hopefully. Sima Malhotra, who's going to be on the panel, is just stuck in traffic. So she's going to join us hopefully in the next 10 minutes or so. She's the Shadow Employment Minister. Then we've got Shabana Taj, who's General Secretary of the Wales TUC, and Catherine Atkinson, who's Secretary of the Society of Labour Lawyers and also a barrister at 9 Gough Chambers. And finally, Andrew Towers, who's Head of Political Strategy at the CWU. And if that's a good, I wish I could have a job title like that, because it's, to me as a politics geek, it sounds like the best possible jobs title you could ever get. So I'm going to hand over to Shabana now, who's going to kick off with her perspective from Wales TUC.
Thanks for the invite, and sorry if I keep touching my screen. My computer is just an absolute nightmare today, and it's only Monday. I thought I would begin by sort of saying a little bit about the Chancellor's recent budget announcement, because, quite frankly, it fell extremely short of what we needed to create a fast and fair recovery. We needed a workers' budget. This was, so far away from that. And now the real danger that we're in, that we end up with mass unemployment following the pandemic, and we see a real further deepening of inequality across, all parts of the country, including here in Wales. So, we were hoping that the budget would protect jobs, set us, a forward plan in terms of recovery with pay protection and job creation at its heart. And, this was really an opportunity to fix extremely long-standing problems that have been exposed in the pandemic, such as the lack of sick pay, protection for millions of workers. Yet it didn't even, touch any of that. And there's been lots of discussion over the last couple of days about, the Biden's bounce back plan and what that could do for the US. And in proportion here, to the GDP, it's 3 times the size of what the UK is planning on spending on its recovery plan. So, the Chancellor's, Rishi's kind of like vision, we think, was extremely, far from ambitious, and it felt like we were almost kind of traveling back in time, doing the same that we'd done previously when the last recession hit, with a focus on who is ultimately going to pay for the pandemic. And, it wasn't the rich that felt any impact of cuts and, over a decade of cuts and austerity, it was workers and it was communities who were lent on, and it was public sector employees, including, large swathes of the civil service that lost their jobs. There was so much that was privatized, and it was communities ultimately that suffered as a reduction in public services and funding for our NHS and local government. Last autumn, the TUC and the affiliated trade unions put forward a proposal for a Build Back Better Council, which would bring unions, employers and governments around the table to work constructively, just like we did in terms of the creation of furlough. Furlough didn't just happen by chance. It was as a result of trade unions and the TUC lobbying the government and working with them. So, this would have been a real opportunity for us to create. It was like the opportunity to create the perfect space to begin some serious discussions on a major investment to secure a strong recovery, upskilling, reskilling people for the future world of work as part of, this job creation drive. And there was a real opportunity to fast track investment in green industry, transport, building, better homes, and we need, 600,000 more public service workers, in effect, actually, to fill so many vacancies that already exist in health and social care. And of course, again, during the pandemic, we've heard from so many frontline workers who have said that actually we are really struggling here with our mental health and well-being, and we don't even know if we're going to be able to continue in this area of work. So in terms of that 600,000, that number could, be even higher. So there was, there's a real opportunity to unlock these jobs and create that sort of space for full employment and healthy public finances. And the TUC's research tells us that we would need an 85 billion investment over the 2 years to create 1.2 million jobs in the new green industry. And thinking about jobs in communities, it's obvious that so many of our challenges aren't new at all, and inequality in all its forms remains our biggest problem. As I said, we've had this decade of austerity, and of course, with that, came the introduction of the gig economy, as we now know. It's so much more precarious work, which meant that the danger of being in a bad job was even, and still is, even greater because of your ethnicity, because of your age, because of your gender, and what qualifications you have, and what sector, of course, that your occupation is in. So the challenge is really twofold here. So we need to be tackling all forms of discrimination that leads us to this, but we also need to make sure that bad jobs become a thing of the past. And of course, then you can't look at, health inequalities either. Health inequalities are far too real. The pandemic has been a further reminder that poverty and health are so interlinked, including, work as well. And one example is this has been people who can't do their jobs from home are more typically, lower paid, and almost half aren't entitled to the usual pay if they're off sick. So around half of those people who can't work from home have faced a massive financial hit if they need to self-isolate. So, a lack of a proper sick pay system has literally undermined infection control. And many of us know that the UK has one of the least generous and least effective sick pay systems amongst so many of the other advanced economies. So we do desperately now need to fix our statutory sick pay. Let's raise it up to at least £330 a week, which will help, match the level of the real living wage. And let's extend eligibility to 2 million low-paid workers who are currently, absolutely excluded from statutory sick pay. And there's been lots of examples of the link between income, wealth, and poorer outcomes. That £20 uplift to the universal credit for 6 months isn't enough, and it means that so many households are then going to be hit, further down the year when the economy is going to be at its lowest point. So we should be looking to make that uplift permanent. Let's, remove that 5-week waiting time for claimants to receive that payment. And we should extend the job retention scheme to at least the end of 2021. And let's bring in a wage floor, of course, to prevent furlough falling below the minimum wage. Too many workers, particularly women, have not been able to work or have struggled to work and take on additional caring responsibilities because of things like homeschooling. And, they haven't been able to make up that financial differential. So they've had to survive on, lots of households have had to survive on 80% wages. So additionally, we need to be pushing to increase child benefit, child tax credit, and remove the child limit, of course, raise the national minimum wage. And, we've seen that, of course, our NHS, everything that it's been, doing over the last 70 years. And we've seen a real renewed appreciation for frontline workers, for key workers, for people in social care. And now, of course, with everything that we've been hearing in terms of the 1% pay increase, we need to do a lot more. We need to be much more bolder in our demands and in our asks and our campaigning, because, those people who have kept us going during this time need all of each and every one of us to be supporting them. And then, of course, there's so much more that I could talk about. And there's so many opportunities. And just to give you the example, we have got a Welsh Labour government who does actually engage with the trade unions in social partnership. They are looking to bring in legislation to ensure and to enshrine in law that we can continue working the way that we have done, but also to find ways and means of bringing in parts of the private sector, maybe through parts of the procurement. So if you are in receipt of government funding, that comes with a series of principles that you must sign up to that includes creating and retaining good quality jobs for the future. So there's some real opportunities. And as I say, we have got a government here in Wales that does engage with trade unions. And I think there's some really good examples of how we've worked together during this period of COVID and what our plans are now, obviously, depending on whether or not we come back with the Labour government with the Welsh Parliament elections around the corner. So, I'll leave it there for now.
Thanks very much, Shavana. Can I ask you just to quickly expand a bit on the social partnership side of things? Because I think that is actually very interesting, and it's not something that is, I think, replicated anywhere else in the UK currently.
Yeah, so the social partnership and procurement bill is pretty much what I was describing that the UK TUC has been lobbying the UK government to kind of do. So they danced around with the issue with working with trade unions, business, and having government around the table. So we created the furlough scheme. We did something for the self-employed. But then when the TUC started saying we also now need to think about what happens next, they've pulled back. And there's what the Welsh government have done is that they've said, well, actually, this has worked really well for us, working in the way that we have done for a very long time. Let's enshrine that in law. We haven't got, the powers that we would like to have in terms of employment protections, employment rights that still are held at a UK level. But is there something that we can do, particularly around the devolved public services? And anyone, as I say, that is, if they are parts of, local government that are procuring services through the private sector, is there something that we can do to secure jobs and to create better good quality jobs where trade unions also have access? So that's going to be the other part of it, is that, lots of people have been talking about how great, Biden is, he's talking about these Amazon workers and so forth. We've got that here in Wales. We've got a government, we've got a Labour government that does that already. So, we don't need to look that far away. You can look much closer.
Great, thank you. I think we've been joined by Seema Malhotra now.
Hi, good evening. So sorry I'm late.
No worries at all. Would you like to go next?
I don't mind either way, but if there are others here who haven't spoken yet, I'm happy to speak a bit later. It's no problem. I can stay till the end now. So.
Oh, can you? Okay. Well, I mean, I think why don't you give us the front bench view, and then I think I just can hopefully kind of react to that.
Great. Okay. Well, look, thank you very much, and thank you to all of you. And it's great to be here with a fabulous panel as well. and great to see Catherine and Shavna also. I'm really kind of pleased you're holding this event as well, because on building good jobs and building an economy that's more inclusive, that's going to be more equal for us coming out than we went in. These have got to be the debates that we're having now, because for all intents and purposes, what we're starting to see is that we're going to emerge less equal, not more, from the economic crisis that we're also facing. And one of the reasons why this is going to be critical is we know that 1 million jobs have been lost during the crisis. We know that vacancies remain much lower as well than the pre-pandemic levels, but also the access to those jobs is very unequal as well. We're having a discussion today as well with the Youth Employment Group about young people getting into work and how much of a challenge they're facing with the kickstart needing a kickstart, and we haven't even seen a start to restart yet. So there's a lot that we have to do. And when we talk when we're talking in the Shadow DWP team, the focus on good jobs and sustainable jobs and the way we're going to rebuild to both have an economy that's going to be inclusive and making sure that it's responding to the lack of resilience that was increasingly characteristic of our economy before the pandemic, and is growing in its in a lack of resilience as well during the pandemic. We have to, in the Labour Party, respond to. One of the government's responses to the crisis was to say that it would pledge 12 billion for a 10-point climate plan to create 250,000 jobs. What we know is that everything that the government is saying it's spending on the green economy is far below what our counterparts are doing as well, far below what France is doing, far below what Germany is doing. And when you think about in a sense, the sort of opportunity penalty that we've seen for young people coming out of the way the government has also handled Brexit, young people having far less in terms of opportunity than young people across Europe, compounded now by decisions that the government is making. And so one of the reasons, that it was quite important that Labour also talked about our own jobs rich green recovery action plan that was really focused on where the good jobs were going to be coming from in the future, how we were going to try and make sure those jobs were accessible to all, and a focus also on how young people who've been hit hardest by the pandemic would be able to get into jobs that weren't just holding jobs, but actually had a future and a future that they could see. That's also alongside plans that we know are desperately needed to fill that 127,000 vacancies in health and social care, the tens of thousands of jobs also in education. But what we also know is that good work is going to need to be fair work. We also know it's going to need a good social security system that's fit for purpose and that underpins workers in the economy. We also know that the rights that workers who are in positions in the economy where they've got inadequate employment rights, very little bargaining power, how the protections for them in the labour market are woefully inadequate as well. But we've also seen the way that so many companies, we've seen this in aviation as well, took advantage of the pandemic to try and erode workers' pay and conditions as well. There were far too many debates that we've had in the House of Commons about fire and rehire, in the sense that we should never have been having those debates. And it was an interesting kind of part of the pandemic, is to see how you could have companies that chose to do the best by their workers, working extremely closely with trade unions. I saw this very, very much firsthand in aviation, because Heathrow is right next to Feltham and Heston. but you had employers that chose to do almost the opposite. And I think this is why, when we talk about why it's so important to be working with the trade unions, I've seen what they've done to make sure that even with the difficulties of the pandemic, that the best is done by workers and the best results come out of partnership working between the unions and management. Now, what we're also going to see is that labour market structures might well change as well. And we're going to need to try and address that in the context of good jobs, workers' rights, and the workplace, a good workplace post-COVID as well. Because as change comes, we're going to need to be in a position to lead rather than lag. It's not a new area. The Taylor Review, in some ways, was clearly a sort of forerunner of looking at in insecure and exploitative work, the quality of work, modern workplace values. But even that is 3-4 years out of date now. I mean, many of those recommendations still need to be looked at, taken forward. We need the employment bill that the government has pushed back repeatedly, that Andy McDonald and I have held a number of events on. And it is staggering when you think about the employment challenge that we're going to face. That is going to be the number one issue facing the country as we emerge from the sort of the health pandemic. Should the vaccine work and we're able to re-establish some level of normality. These are the things to be looking at now, because otherwise you're going to see a rise in insecure work. And that culture is going to be harder to shift once it starts to cement. So now is the time to be saying, if we want to have an alternative, this is the time to be legislating where we might need to protect rights. And this is where we also need to be looking at what a good workplace is going to look like post-COVID. How are we going to learn from what makes a safe workplace and a healthy workplace? And a safe workplace is COVID safe, but there's also tackling sort of a well-being, supporting people to potentially be working at home or in their communities part-time rather than all the time in the office. There's going to be demand, I think, for a balance of work and life, and how we're going to respond to some of that. One of the areas might well be, what do we think about flexible recruitment, or flexible recruiting, and how might we want employers to advertise for work? And I think there's also just a final kind of area that I might mention. It's really critical that the government looks again more closely at effective employment support, because if we're to see people being able to access jobs of the future, and that could be young or it could be older people, because we know that older people in age 50 plus are in the end sometimes the hardest to get back, find it the hardest to get back into work. Not least for challenges them with their own, could be caring responsibilities, or it could be health issues as well. So if we want to keep people active in the labour market at different ages as well, we're going to need to look to how people have access to those jobs of the future, how we create them as well to be inclusive. And that also has got to come through the government, and how it looks at employment support connected very closely with skills development and opportunity for skills development, rather than people coming out of the workplace feeling like they're on their own, particularly in a world where people aren't meeting as much, and not being able to be signposted to those opportunities. So I'll just close by saying that we've got to look to how we're going to have high quality jobs for the future, how we're going to be able to transition to those high quality jobs as well, how we're going to look to support people to stay in work during this time. There's still a challenge to go with lockdown and furlough currently being extended, but a cliff edge currently awaiting us unless the government sees sense again. And how we've got to make sure that we're not seeing young people going into jobs through the Kickstart scheme or elsewhere where they're not really being developed with prospects for the future. One of the most important things about the Future Jobs Fund was how it did focus on as well sustainable and good quality work. It was designed in from the beginning, and that's where I think making sure that Kickstart delivers to what it was promising at the beginning for young people who have been hit the hardest, is one of the ways in which we'll make sure that for certainly for the next generation, that already what's been a sort of lost year for young people doesn't turn into a sort of lost generation, because that is something that's within the government's control, and that is something that all policymakers should be worried about. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Seema, for that overview, picking up a lot of really important points, including, I think, talking about kind of precarious work, which is a good point to move on to Catherine, who is a barrister at Nine Groff Chambers and is going to be talking, amongst other things, about the recent Uber judgment.
Thank you very much. And Seema is absolutely right. Good jobs need to be underpinned by strong employment rights and make sure that they are actually protected, and reform of employment law is well overdue. And yes, the Supreme Court judgment in relation to Uber has taken us one step in the right direction, but some really fundamental changes are required. And I wanted to cover just some of the long-standing issues that we've seen in relation to precarious employment. I will mention the Supreme Court judgment in the Uber litigation and the implications for that, and look at some of the issues in actually enforcing employment rights, as well as looking to the future. When I was thinking about what I would contribute this evening, I did look back at a chapter that I co-wrote with John Bowers QC and Tom Jones from Thompson's in relation to Law Reform 2015. So he wrote it in 2014 about what we wanted to see a future Labour government do when it comes to, and we specifically wrote about employment law. And it was so depressing to read again, because the issues remain, and in some cases have got even worse. And we talked about precarious employment, sham self-employment, sham standard form contracts, 0-hour contracts, the need for tribunal reform, and the problem of enforcement. And sadly, does it sound familiar? Because 6 years later, the issues are ongoing, and that our employment law derives from kind of 19th and early 20th century law of kind of master and servant. And we do have these three categories of employment status. We have employees, we have workers, and we have independent contractors. And it just doesn't fit well with the world of work that we've seen in the last kind of at least 40 years becoming more and more precarious. I mean, an independent contractor can be such a huge range of professions. It literally goes from self-employed barrister like myself to some part-time cleaners, from construction work to financial advisors. It does cross the breadth of jobs that we find in our economy, and the difference with so many of those is where you do have such an inequity between the employer and the worker. And the Uber judgment, when the litigation there started, also 6 years ago, Uber had relied upon their kind of standard written contracts, and they argued that drivers were independent contractors, and they emphasized that they could work as little or as much as they wanted. But the Supreme Court said, no, on the facts, they said there was no written contract, but they said that you had to look at the relationship from what was actually happening, from the conduct, and you had to look at the purpose of the legislation. And the legislation was there to give protection to vulnerable workers. It was there to prevent them being paid too little. It was there to prevent them working excessive hours. And that dependency and subordination, rather than the written contract, was crucial. And it was also really going to be important to the gig economy, that it was when they were deemed to be working whenever they were logged onto the app, not just when they were actually driving customers around. So it will have a significant impact in being able to say that more people aren't independent contractors, they are workers, and therefore they should get holiday pay, and they should get some of the protections that you are entitled to as a worker. But it really is, that's the bare minimum, because to get the protections of being an employee, you need 2 years employment and so many things that we consider to be our employment rights, they are still not entitled to. And then even if you are an employee, as Seema's already mentioned, we've seen the danger of the fire and rehire that employers can utilize. And even if you are an employee, even if you have a very clear breach that you can demonstrate, you have to you have to go to an employment tribunal to actually enforce that. And if you aren't in a trade union, doing that on your own can be hugely difficult for people. It is often hard to get any kind of legal advice unless you can afford it. And then even if you win, there are real issues in actually enforcing the judgment and getting your damages. So it is hurdle after hurdle. And all the rights in the world mean nothing if you can't enforce them. And I think that the public agree that exploitative 0 hours shouldn't exist. They agree that there shouldn't be sham self-employment. They agree that it's wrong to have people kind of the equivalent of the early morning lineup on the docks waiting to find out whether they're going to get pay. But all we have seen from the Conservative government is warm words. Now, Seema mentioned the Taylor Review, though I think we could go much further. But in the Queen's speech in 2019, they promised an employment bill. We're now more than a year later, and it's not likely to happen until the end of this year or the beginning of next. And they've talked about things from the review, like a single enforcement body. But the real question is, will it have any teeth? Because I do a lot of workplace accidents, and you look at the Health and Safety Executive, and after 10 years of austerity, they've lost 58% of their funding. They've had to reduce their staffing by over a third. I think even if you just look at how COVID is being handled, you've got kind of 50,000 individuals facing fines, but not a single employer. And we did see the coalition way back when removed civil liability for breaches of health and safety legislation. So rather than, so what we had before is if there was a breach of that health and safety legislation, someone was hurt, then the employer would have to pay damages for that. Now that actually meant that employers were rather more careful about complying with health and safety legislation. If you are fully aware that the likelihood of being prosecuted by the HSE is minimal, then there is no stick to ensure that employers are doing what they should. And we've already heard, and I completely agree, that good jobs are often where you've got employers working well, where they're respecting workers, where they are wanting to contribute, and where they're listening to trade unions. And there is so much more that needs to be done. But the moral of this story is we do not want in 6 years' time to still be talking about employment rights. We want to, yes, absolutely hold the government to account, but we need a Labour government, and one that will actually ensure that we have rights that people can rely on.
Thanks very much, Catherine. That was great. Can I just pick up on one kind of point? This is a bit of a geeky point, but I think might be important, and which is that it's interesting what you said about that they looked at the purpose of the legislation for applying it, because presumably the Uber law they were applying was, if it started 6 years ago, was pre-Brexit. And I just wonder whether, that, kind of attack on, there's obviously this broader attack now on kind of legal institutions. And, could one of those also be around this kind of more, this purposive interpretation of law to going to what was kind of, we used to have more of, which was, a kind of literal interpretation, which might have let Uber off the hook?
I think that we do have a history where employers have been relying upon, and that's why I talked about kind of sham standard contract terms, because they would almost write into the contracts all the things that they would know would normally exclude them from being considered an employer, which actually doesn't look at the reality of the conduct between the parties. So I think it is a step in the right direction. I think I think unfortunately it's fact specific. So we want to make sure that that is then, I think there will probably be a lot more litigation to come. But I do think that it's fantastic that we haven't seen the government step in, but the courts have looked at trying to ensure that we do have that protection.
Great, thank you. I'll now hand over to Andrew to give us the view of his view from the CWU, which is of course a great union, and one that I remember fondly working with when I was a long time ago working for Emily Thornberry in a marginal seat, and we had a great relationship with the CWU in in Islington with Gary Heather and others.
Great, thank you. So thanks, Omar. And normally you'd kind of kick off speaking on an event like this and say, it's really nice to be here. But here is just me in my kitchen, which is where I've been for the past year or so. So that would probably sound pretty insincere. But actually tonight, I've been wondering where Seema's background picture is from. And I was kind of watching her and thinking that's exactly where I want to be. But so I work at the Communication Workers Union, and we cover predominantly the postal and telecom sectors. And I'll touch on those both a little bit and what we've seen there. But I want to start off with a bit of a broader perspective initially. And one of the things that we feel is that there are really severe problems in the world of work, as each of the speakers have kind of touched upon. But I think the crucial thing that Shavana said kind of straight off was that these are long-standing problems that predate the pandemic. So at the end of 2019, then, by my estimate, it was about 8 million workers. So about 1 in 4 workers who are earning less than a genuine living wage. So, that's a staggering figure that a quarter of people weren't earning enough to get by on. And for all the talk that there's been of a jobs miracle and the improvement that we've seen in the employment rate, then actually over the past decade, 2/3 of that growth has been in insecure employment. So in self-employment, in agency, or on 0 hours contracts. So it's been a really appalling decade. Alongside that, we've obviously seen the longest squeeze on living standards on pay for about 200 years. And trade union membership rates are at, there was a slight pickup last year, but are at fairly historic lows. So all of these issues that we've got in the labour market predate what we've seen and some of the worries with COVID. But again, the key point that I think we all need to recognise tonight is, our concern now is not just that we fail to build back better, but that what we're seeing means we're actually going to be building back worse. And, I'm going to point to a couple of things that suggest that. So the first is the level of unemployment. So from before the pandemic, unemployment, stands to rise over the remainder of this year by about 70%. To about 2.2 million. Now, that level of unemployment we haven't seen for a good number of years now, and it's going to be with us for a number of years. That's not just bad for the people who've lost their jobs, it's bad for the economy, but it's also bad for everybody who's in work at the moment, because it means their bargaining power is going to decline. Now, the second reason why we're particularly concerned about where things are headed is that we know that businesses across the economy, local government as employers, are under severe financial pressure. Over the past year, that's really started to tell with fire and rehire in particular. So by the TUC's estimates, 1 in 10 workers have been threatened with fire and rehire, where effectively the employer is saying, unless you sign up to these terms and conditions, which are worse than you're on at the moment, and in some cases it's really striking, we're talking about pay deductions of about 10 or 15%, or significant increases in working hours every single week, then, the employer will just fire them. So we're already seeing those things starting to come through. Now, in our industries, in post and telecoms, this is bang in line with our own experiences. So these two industries, have been doing fairly well throughout the pandemic. But in BT at the moment, so we've just announced that we're going to hold a ballot for industrial action, which would be the first industrial action that we've taken since 1987 because of compulsory redundancies and attacks on people's terms and conditions. In the postal sector, which has actually seen a boom, if you think about all the parcels and online deliveries, over the past 6 months, 50,000 jobs have been created. But what's worrying is that these are being created by, so Amazon, Hermes, DPD, Yodel. So the issues that Catherine has highlighted, with bogus self-employment, these are companies that heavily rely on those kind of models. So as I say, our real concern now is not just that we fail to build back better, but that actually we're going to build back in a way that's worse. So, the key question tonight is, what do we need to do about this? How are we going to build that good jobs economy? So the CWU has been calling for a while for a new deal for workers. And we do think that the level of ambition that we saw from FDR back in the 1930s is the level that we need to be thinking of at the moment. And, as Shavana, I think, was talking about, this idea that we need to boost it like Biden, that the IPPR has highlighted, is exactly what we need to be thinking about as a labour movement. And I'm just going to sketch, because I don't have a lot of time, 3 kind of broad areas that we fleshed out as part of a new deal for workers that we want to see. So the first of those is that we think we urgently need to raise the floor on employment rights and end insecurity. So people are well aware of, there are well-established calls from the TUC and the Labour Party to do this. So firstly, a £10 an hour minimum wage, that would raise the pay of about 4 in 10 key workers, a ban on 0 hours contracts, a ban on bogus self-employment, a ban on fire and rehire. So alongside that, as Shavana again talked about, raising statutory sick pay and also full employment rights from day one that closes some of the loopholes that are being used for agency workers. Now, we've talked a bit about the government's employment bill, and we don't know when that's going to be coming down the line, but we think the trade union movement and the Labour Party needs to be mounting a campaign on that bill, with a positive agenda for what, for what a good world of work looks like coming out of the pandemic. So the second broad area is, a major stimulus package to boost and create good jobs for the future. So where the government is on this at the moment, effectively it falls way short of what is necessary with the level of unemployment that we're going to be seeing. So, the TUC, as Shavana again said, set out a plan at the start of last summer for an £85 billion investment package in infrastructure that would have created 1.2 million good jobs. So we in particular are looking at that on broadband. So we know that as a country, we need to invest in broadband. Investing, so I think it's about £3 billion could deliver 40,000 decent jobs in broadband over the next 2 years. And that is the kind of infrastructure that can then boost growth, that can then boost the industries that we need in the future, alongside the level of investment that we need to meet our net zero targets, and make sure that we're not missing the kind of opportunity that Seema has talked about. And then, of course, for us, the final element that I want to touch on of what we need to see on, to improve the world of work, is a shift in the balance of power. So Catherine's highlighted the problems with enforcement and the different agencies. The most effective way to enforce rights at work and to improve your terms and conditions is by having a trade union there. Now, we can perhaps in the questions, get onto what the trade unions need to do, but there are several policy issues that would make it much easier to grow the trade union movement. So that's access to workplaces, it's sectoral collective bargaining, it's reducing the recognition thresholds that are stopping us getting in and being able to negotiate. So those 3 broad areas, the start of the package that we think, and Omar, at the start, you said, what's the positive agenda? There is much more that we can talk about, from working time to flexible working to democracy in the workplace, things like workers on boards. These kind of things flesh out a bit of a positive vision for the future. And equally, as Seema said, over the next kind of few months, we're about to see, a lot of people being told what their working arrangements are going to be, in terms of working at the office, or whether they can work from home. And when I say that they'll be told this, we know these discussions are going on with employers. In many cases, they're not going on with their workers and trade unions where they are present. So this is an agenda that we really need to start thinking about when we think about what is the positive vision for the future of work. So I'm just going to round off with a final point, which is, we are really keen for the Labour Party and the union movement as a whole to start pushing this now. So there's been a huge cut through on issues around the world of work during the pandemic. So on the pay of key workers, on the level of statutory sick pay, on the value of trade unions. poll after poll has shown that there is huge appetite not to go back to the old normal, but to go back better. And strategically, we feel that this is the time for the Labour Party to start making the case for this. We think we need a positive agenda, not just to be responding to the Tories, and that we need to be doing that now. So we've done the groundwork for an election in 4 years' time.
Great. Thank you very much, Andrew. That was excellent and very, very interesting and helpful. And I definitely, something that I'd be keen to be involved in. I think lots of people in Open Labour would be too. In that respect, I just want to ask the panel a question about a kind of, and maybe my feeling is wrong. Maybe you have different views from me, but I feel somehow that the Labour as in the kind of worker agenda within Labour has been a bit of a dialogue between the trade unions and engagement there, but maybe not really like a broader kind of discussion. And I guess I was thinking today about Ed Miliband talking about pre-distribution, and I honestly never followed it that closely, but to my kind of simple view of it, pre-distribution basically means to me higher wages, but you never see anyone on a leaflet say we're going to get people higher wages. But I mean, that's surely something that almost everyone must be in favour of, and it's quite important to everyone. So I just kind of would be interested to know how you see this from a political point of view. Kind of how do we build a story? How do we build it in the Labour Party, and how do we build it as in terms of communicating with voters? I mean, I think maybe in the US and places like Australia, the Labour Party or the left is more kind of comfortable kind of work, campaigning in this kind of way. So be interested to have people's views. I don't know who wants to go first. Shab? Yeah.
I think that, well, I'm going to have to go back to what I know as my normal. My normal is that we have a government that has unions, that has business, that has, even representatives of the third sector. So community grassroots organisations, our Future Generations and Wellbeing Commissioner, we all literally work in social partnership to make all of these things happen. So our conversation is already much broader, I guess, than, what is, deemed as normal at a UK level. So we've actually been looking at more that we can even press the government on here. So there's been a conversation, for example, around people who work from home, linking that back into, the Welsh Labour Party have, the Welsh Labour government, should I say, have set themselves an agenda to continue to have a particular percentage of people to continue to work from home. We've now been saying, but what about those people, for example, who can't work from home? So yes, absolutely. Let's look at the benefits of protecting those workers who can work from home. But what about those people who have to physically go out to work? So what more can we do for those people so that we don't end up creating like this real class division? So, we've started to kind of take the conversation to another direction now. So we're talking about low paid workers, predominantly, lower income families, women in particular, who've had to carry on working, would after this pandemic are going to still have to carry on working. They don't have the option of home working. So let's look at, things like better childcare. Let's look at, maybe providing some additional financial support so that when people take the bus or take some form of public transport into work, that it is cheaper for them to be able to travel. Let's look at the options of schools and whether or not actually, rather than it being linked to what options you have available to where you live, but have that option of maybe to where you work to make your life a bit easier. So, there is all of that. And I think that, we've got some really good examples, and it goes back to what some of the previous speakers have said, where we've got examples now where businesses and trade unions have been working collaboratively to, lobby government sometimes jointly. I never thought that we would be talking to CPI and the FSB and actually agreeing on stuff at times. So through the back of that, for example, particularly for the culture sector, And now we're looking for the hospitality sector. For the culture sector, we created a culture contract, which means that, again, there's a series of principles that people have to sign up to that protect people within some of the most precarious, worst kind of like contracts and jobs that exist. And now we're also looking at hospitality as well. And workers on boards is a good idea, and it's one that we again have here, and it's something that the unions have been pushing for. And again, as part of the social partnership and procurement bill, will then be embedded into legislation. But if you haven't got, if unions don't have access to be able to organize workers, regardless, because those workers are members of their community too. They're not two separate things, are they? They are one thing.
Thank you. Andrew?
Yeah, so I think that to pick up on the points you made, Omar, then to an extent, work is always going to be dominated within the Labour Party as a conversation by trade unions. But I think one of the things that we started to see, so the 4-day week campaign is probably an example of where kind of more Labour members have started to get engaged over this. And I do think that will continue to grow over the coming years. The one issue that strikes me is, so I mentioned working from home, last autumn when there was basically, the kind of government out on the front pages telling everybody to get back to work, felt like a real moment politically. And I think we're going to see, something similar in terms of the politicization of work, people being told what's happening in their workplaces by an employer over the coming months. And it's an opportunity for Labour and the trade union movement to really own that agenda and perhaps increase membership. And we should be talking about that. The final point, Omar, you make about language is absolutely crucial. So, one issue I think on this is, we talk about trade union rights. Actually, to somebody who doesn't know what a trade union is, that's not really going to register with them. It's about their rights, to organise at work. And I think you're right. At times we should focus actually on the end rather than the means. So, we want to democratise companies as a means to improving your employment standards and your terms and conditions at work and your working life. So, we need to position it a bit differently where we're saying, this is an agenda to improve your working life. And the way we do that is ABC, and those are some of the more technical things that ABC unions get involved in. We're all in that kind of discussion on.
Could I come in on a couple of points, Omar? Hello, is Omar there?
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just saying, you moved on my screen.
It's okay now. I think I've just, for some reason, my laptop needs to be plugged into 2 power cords actually after a certain point. So, and I forgot that the other power cord is upstairs. I think it's working now, so power ahead.
Fabulous, thank you. Look, I just want to make 2 reflections, areas I don't think we've perhaps covered as much so far. But firstly, just on the point about reflecting on what's going on in Wales, I think it's a really good example of where we're going to get some of our best ideas for what we are in government from what Labour's able to do in either in local authorities or devolved administrations or our regions and nations. And it's really interesting that Sadiq has also got a good work standard, which is bringing together best employment practice in London, wanting to link support across London with employers. It's developed in consultation with professional bodies and others. And I think what's really important about it is it's really building on this spirit of partnership, getting an accreditation, doing all of the things that we know actually lead to better outcomes for organisations as well as for workers, whether that's in reduced absences and sick leave or and better wages, the best skills and skills development. There's a way in which we measure things differently, and there's an old phrase, sort of get what you measure, really. And so I think that there's quite a lot for us to be learning from from what impact that has for on jobs in London. I was also struck by employers that have told me that when they increased pay to the London living wage, that it had increased retention and morale, and it had actually had a positive effect on the workplace. And these were Heathrow based employers who were telling me this, and it's one of those areas where you think, it's so obvious, and the experience is now there to be talking about how you can change the workplace and change the workplace culture and look differently at how you have a sort of partnership with unions and with employees as well. But how now with London, we've got a good work standard that's now going to, I think, provide a way in which employers can learn best practice, can also see who's adopting a good work standard and who isn't. And so I really hope that we'll see that start to grow. And it's one of the things that I hope, recognizing that we've seen such difficult times for workers through this whole recession, with far less leverage than they would have, in other circumstances, and really kind of brought to bear with rehire practices. That reforming workplace culture and what we want from employers is part of where politics can help lead a debate. But secondly, I want to mention about women, because women are being kind of worse hit during the whole COVID period, not just in terms of being frontline workers really affected, but also seeing reductions in income, job losses, etc. And my worry is that, with women also taking the bulk of looking after children, homeschooling, stepping back from the workplace, women who are self-employed, feeling they can't, be attentive to their own employment, we're looking at a culture of work that's it's a danger of going backwards decades in terms of seeing men being the ones going out to, support the family, and the woman staying at home. And you can always start to look at where's the thin end of the wedge, because things can creep in if you don't say there's a trend here and we need to check it and we need to challenge it and we need to reverse it. So I'll just put that out there as well, because women, ethnic minorities, those who we know have been hit harder by the pandemic, are going to be hit harder for much longer, unless we have active ways in which we're looking to ensure that there's much more equality in workplace practices and in employment.
I completely agree with Seema. And it was interesting when you said that surely everyone is in favour of higher wages, but I think we need to make sure that people understand that higher wages and better terms and conditions does not mean that businesses will fail. It does not mean that businesses will recruit fewer people. And Seema is completely right when she talks about the kind of the increase in retention and morale and employees feeling valued and therefore invested in the businesses that they are a part of. And I think as well as being good for the businesses themselves, it's better for the economy if people are in stable work. If they have stable income, they're more willing to. They have the ability to spend money and to actually to buy things that so many businesses are wanting to sell. So I think there is still an argument to be made, and we need to continue to make it, that actually it is good for everyone to make sure that workers are treated properly. And I think that we have seen an increase in trade union membership, and I think that is fantastic and the small silver lining in what has been a horrendous year for people. But when I was a parliamentary candidate in Erewash, and I did a living wage campaign with a group of sixth formers, and when we talked about kind of what you would do if things were difficult at work, or if you weren't earning enough, and not a single one of them identified trade unions as something that could offer protection and that could offer a way to improve their lives, but also the businesses as well. And I think that while a lot of work is being done, there is still a lot more that we need to be stressing, especially when you see so much of the workforce in the gig economy and in unprotected work, when it's so much harder for trade unions to organise.
Thanks, Catherine. I just want to ask Seema a quick question on something, which is on in the 2019 manifesto, the one of the pledges was to put in place a workers' protection agency to enforce workers' rights, so that rather than having to go to an employment tribunal, you could have enforcement through an agency in the way that, you know, other regulators enforce requirements. And that seems to make quite a lot of sense to me, because certainly, at least there's you know, if you've been unfairly dismissed, then you might go to an employment tribunal, although there are lots of problems with how they're operating at the moment. But if someone's, for example, breaching you know, other rights, it's unlikely people are going to go to an enforcement tribunal. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that kind of agency. And
yeah, thank you very much, Omar. Let me just agree with you about the issues that tribunals are facing and the woeful backlog that they have now. Yet another example of a lack of resilience in our public services as a result of what the government's done. And I just mentioned about the HSE as well, because this is also pretty staggering, about how there's been effectively 150 million cut over 10 years from the HSE, and that drop of 500 inspectors. So the government might say we're giving back 14 million, but that's a drop in the ocean from what they've lost, which has affected both workplace safety and enforcement as well. You're absolutely right. And look, there's been debates on this in Parliament. You know, the government talking about, you know, what was in the Tory manifesto as well, and a sort of single enforcement body. And Andy McDonnell, you know, in speaking in the debate, raised this. It's the reason why we need to have the employment bill, because that's where we need to be talking about all of this and legislating for it as well. So I think that this is certainly something that Andy and I are continuing to try and find ways to keep on the radar, put the pressure on the government to bring forward an employment bill. And I think look for a way in which that's going to respond to what COVID has also sort of exposed, so that we actually do see, you know, not just, you know, good work, better workplaces, more support for and you know, more support for employees and their rights in those workplaces. You know, fewer of the anomalies that we found. I've got a very, very difficult case at the moment I'll just share, where a woman who has effectively been full-time paid in a role for 6 years because of the way her employer has defined her as I think a flexible worker, even though a variable pay worker, even though for all intents and purposes was not. She actually has lost out on thousands of pounds of pay through furlough because of how her income is defined for the year that she was on maternity leave, and you know, and kind of, you know, when it comes down to what it actually means for somebody, for the way their rights are being defined or not defined, when it could be an alternative for actually what's happened. You know, this is where we do need to look at this, because there's far too many people caught out without then having the routes through which they can challenge and you know, hopefully get a fairer outcome.
Thanks, Seema. So I'm just gonna, there's a final question here from Margaret Onions, which is hopefully a kind of positive note, which is, should we be talking about Build Back Better or free ourselves to think differently by talking about build forward better. So perhaps everyone could give a quick input on build forward better and any other kind of concluding remarks. Shall we start with Catherine?
Well, I'm going to be very short and sweet because I quite agree. I think that there is a big hurdle, but there are also opportunities. But I do come back to when we are not in power as the Labour Party, we are having to win the public over to understanding the benefits of good work and good jobs. And I think that we need to be holding the government to account, but ultimately I don't want to be having this discussion in 6 years' time. So there is a lot of work to do to make sure that we can build forward better and build a world that we actually want our children to grow up in, make sure that we've got the work that's going to take the country and the world forward.
Great, thank you. Shavana?
Whether you say build back better or build forward, I mean, a lot of these things are strap lines, right? And it's about what sounds good at the time. I mean, build back better, a lot of the phraseology has really been then alongside it has been about shovel-ready jobs and creating shovel-ready jobs, which again, just sounds like women just are not included at all. So that's problematic. So the language is problematic, but at the end of the day, it's all about learning, not only from the pandemic, but also accepting the fact that we've had over a decade of austerity and what that did to communities, and ensuring, for me anyway, that we have those conversations about the mistakes that were made during the pandemic as well, because everything that the government has done hasn't been, they haven't approached everything in the best way. There was the cuts that they made and the austerity that was felt very deeply is part of the reason why the enforcement agencies that should have been there to protect people weren't able, to be there to protect people. And then, when they brought people back into the HSC, for example, they had to, reskill people, and it was a whole program. And I just think that, for me going forward, it's about, what are we going to do? Are we going to listen to people? We also need to look at the, health inequalities here as well. We can't just look at economy solely. Everything is interlinked. And it is about, for me, it's about building back more equitably and more inclusively and through a just and green transition. That's got to be the primary focus, whatever strapline you want to use.
Thank you. Now, Andrew, please.
Yeah, so I imagine we're all going to echo each other and say we want to look forward. But I think what one interesting thing on this, do you look forward or back, is I think when people are looking for analogies of what we do coming out of the pandemic now, then 1945 seems to be one that polls really well. So this is why you hear people referring to it quite a lot. So that might be one reason why we kind of look backwards. The second thing that I'd say just on this kind of build back better is the government has appropriated it, but let's hold them to that. Let's use this slogan against them, just like they said they were going to build a country that works for everyone. Let's say you said you were going to build back better. You said you were going to do whatever it takes. You said you would protect everyone. Let's hold them to their own rhetoric. And the final thing is the CW, we've been very clear on the slogan and the language we're using. That's a new deal for workers. So please look out for that on Twitter. And please get behind our campaign for the Labour Party and the Labour movement to fight for exactly that.
That's great, thank you. Finally, Seema.
Great. Keep it short.
You're going into the police bill after this,
Sorry.
Is that?
Well, I'll have to be following it, yeah.
Right.
But anyway, definitely build, definitely better than the Tories. And if it's going back, it's got to go back to to when Labour was in power. But I think I'm a forward person. I'm a forward-looking person. I must say I'm a glass half full person. So I've actually stopped using build back better as far as possible. So I think that's one thing that perhaps Margaret and I might have in common. But I would honestly say that we've got to, in Labour, be really leading the conversation about how we go forward and come out of this crisis. And so definitely build and definitely better than the Tories.
Great. Well, thank you very much to Seema, Catherine, Andrew, and Shavana. It's been really interesting, really good contributions. And I hope that certainly Open Labour can keep working on these issues and support the work of the CW and the TUC and look at how we can really keep building forward. Or back, if that's what you prefer, or better, if that's what you prefer. But anyway, yes, forward to socialism. All right, okay, thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, Omar.